Hey folks, so this week I'll once again be diving into the world of roguelites, as I'll be tackling the review copy I received of Seenapsis Studios' I am sorry if I brutalized that name's card-battling puzzler, A Long Way Down. This title definitely tries to put its own spin on deck building, but did it make for an experience that left me flush with glee, or was this roguelike not playing with a full deck? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. A Long Way Down follows Sam, a mage of sorts. More specifically, it follows his exodus into Limbo after his recent and arguably untimely death. Essentially, this title can be summed up as our protagonist receiving funeral rites from his mentor and his attempting to accept his demise. Though this process is somewhat complicated by the altogether antagonistic Dungeon Master that rules over this section of the hereafter, and the manner in which they decide to torment any lost soul that wanders into their domain. With Sam's path to passing on imperiled, he's forced to battle his way to Limbo's heart in order to overthrow the Dungeon Master, all while coming to terms with his life and death. Anyways, with the summary out of the way, I may as well talk about the execution. So, beyond the initial introduction, a good chunk of A Long Way Down's backstory is fed to the player in the scenes provided between each of Limbo's major regions. These help to give a bit more context as to how Sam got to where he was, both magically as well as mortally. Not gonna lie, the guy's a bit of a jerk. That said, if you're hoping for a satisfying conclusion, you're likely to be disappointed, with the outcome being just all in all weird and making much of the journey feel a bit moot, really. Still, as much as I found myself disappointed by the main story arc, I'll admit that there were narrative beats I found charming. Specifically, I enjoyed the bits of dialogue that cropped up between Sam and the companions he finds along his journey. This was likely my favorite element of A Long Way Down, and my habit of taking my time in progressing generally meant I got to see all of it on a given stage. Admittedly, this is also the part of why I was a little less keen on the ending, since your companions are effectively screwed by the abrupt way the plot ends. Oh, and while there's a secondary pit mode, that's entirely bereft of plot, but don't worry, I'll tackle that later. Because first, we gotta address the core mechanics. A Long Way Down is a bit of an odd duck, after all. For the main campaign, you're essentially tasked with navigating a number of stages by either making a path to the exit or by achieving the central objective of the stage. What complicates this is how movement in general works. See, Limbo is a really weird place, a series of disconnected platforms riddled with traps and creatures. In order to get anywhere, you'll need to make use of the tile deck, allowing you to plant down pathways you can make your way where you need to go from island to island. That said, this is complicated by the Dungeon Master. This friggin' jerk. I talked about him earlier. See, you can only move around or plant so many tiles in a given turn, and once yours comes to an end, our buddy the DM gets to take an action, which in this case involves using one of your precious finite tiles in order to make an absolute mess of the board. We're talking obnoxious actions like using a tile destruction card to strand you, or flipping around a tile so that pathway you just made becomes a dead end, or just planting down an utterly useless tile somewhere else, or a precious tile, but putting it out in the boonies so you can no longer access it. I can't actually count the number of times I found myself foregoing the placement of a convenient route, if only because there were good odds if I didn't get rid of other tiles, there were excellent odds that he was going to screw me over. Which also led to me being very cautious about picking up new tiles, just so I could explore the stages at my leisure without having to worry about him making a complete mess of things and putting me under the clock. In part, this is also because if you find yourself unable to clear the level's main objective, or to reach the exit, and there's no piles of tiles nearby, you're screwed! You have no option but to restart the current stage. That said, the more pertinent answer to my intentions was simply that there is a decent amount of stuff to do on each board. There's treasure chests and idols that you can loot for precious equipment, and new cards to add to your deck. That, and just ample caches of the game's currency, dust. There's campsites that provide you healing opportunities, shrines that can empower your characters, and then there's the most pivotal location of all, the various workshop stations. Because here is an element I hate. about A Long Way Down. Despite the fact that you wind up carrying around a boatload of weapons and armor and cards by the time you're done with each stage, you can't actually equip anything on the fly, save at these spots. Yeah, there's something incredibly insulting about getting all your shit pushed in while you're busy carrying around a legendary piece of armor that you're just not allowed to put on arbitrarily. Now, this isn't quite as bad in the main game, given it does offer you workshops between each stage to arrange your gear, modify the overall layout of your deck, as well as upgrade and craft things. But then we come to the Pit, A Long Way Down's endless roguelite mode that just reminds you life isn't quite easy because you're granted no such leeway. You can wind up wasting an inordinate amount of time before you're even granted the means of using anything you've acquired. Worst of all, the workshops are split up in function. Now you have forges and things specifically meant to allow you the ability to interact with your deck. So it all isn't combined. Each of these are separate instances you need to wander over and use. Worse still, these forges, these workshops, they aren't the most intuitive things to navigate. For instance, if you're upgrading a card in your deck and you also happen to have a double that's not in there, it's really up in the air whether or not you will improve the one that's equipped. And given the locations that empower the cards in the pit aren't the spots you equip them at, well, you just might be stuck waiting a long while to find a location so you can rearrange these. Just fucking... Oh, and the equipment, same deal, except even worse. Because even if you do upgrade an item you have equipped, it might be on the wrong character. And you can't efficiently get rid of copies of gear for resources because even if you have a stack of 10 helmets and you're only wearing one, they won't let you get rid of them so long as one person has them equipped. Unlike cards in your deck, which you can in fact destroy them even if you have no equipped, and it will randomly take whether it's the one that's equipped or one of the ones that are just hanging around in your armory, not in your deck. Yay! But I digress, because there's still a central element I need to talk about, and that's the combat. Combat in A Long Way Down is just a bit weird, honestly. You're given a deck composed of a few cards related to the items your characters are wearing, a basic attack card based on the weapon you're wielding, and a relatively small deck. There is apparently a way to shuffle the deck in exchange for health, but I actually went through the entirety of the game without ever needing to rely on this, mostly by sheer virtue of building a deck built around rapidly scaling and blowing things up. Eee. Which, speaking of scaling, you have a small gamut of characters you eventually wind up in control of. 3, to be exact. Though you're afforded a few more options in Endless Mode of who to bring with you. That said, of all the characters you're granted access to, I wound up favoring one if only because of the central difference between them, which is to say their passive abilities. All of the characters have passives. Sam, for instance, can recycle cards as opposed to discarding them. The Roman dude, whose name currently eludes me, has a 5% chance to take half damage and is good at buffing. And then there's Neffy. Whereas a lot of the other characters have passives which have a 1 in goddamn 20 chance of activating, and a couple of the optional characters you can bring to the pit are useful for having pertinent passive, Neffy is in a league of her own. She's granted a permanent boost to healing, which is phenomenal for staying power, and a dust bonus for any creature she kills. Neither of these are random, and this latter one basically just makes her an economy onto herself and a key figure in keeping your entire party alive. Especially important given that when a character dies, it stays dead until the next stage, or in the case of the pit, until you find a resurrection idol. That said, given that the primary advantage to having more characters is your energy cap, and thus the amount of cards you can play in a turn increasing, and that remains even when a character is dead, well, with a solid enough deck, the death of your friends is more of a nuisance than a major issue. Screwed up, I know, like a part of me wanted to mess around more with fine-tailoring the characters into very different roles, but at the end of the day, it was ultimately more efficient to just invest in a couple of group healing spells so enemies could waste their time thwacking my peers who refuse to die, before Neffy invariably beat their ass so hard they spontaneously turned into cash. Also, another grievance here, but combat's just slow. There's not really a way to skip animations during it, nor to speed up the animation of the keeper placing tiles. Which, it's just a bit of a problem, given that picking all those fights was also the best way to find new cards to add to my deck, to make the money I need to upgrade things, to get items. Like, sure, the objectives did occasionally provide neat loot as to cracking open chests, and certainly, I found myself benefiting from the item options you're granted when you first clear the end of each area. That said, the majority of my cards were acquired from just running headlong into fights, which is really time-consuming and also highly dependent on RNG's smiling on you. Also, a few of the spells get some rather distinct changes in their utility as you upgrade them, but you can only see the upgrade level after your current one, which is a bit of a thing since you can upgrade a card 3 times and their final form might provide them some very distinct boons from their initial form. Also, as much as the game promised that your choices would majorly alter the final fight, I'm going to give you a very slight spoiler here. It uses your deck. It's not a major narrative twist or some "your actions along the way will haunt you. That generic NPC will remember you did that." Nah, he just uses your deck against you. That's it. Also, given you can replay earlier levels in normal mode, there's really not much stopping you from farming up extra cards or dust to upgrade your gear and just straight up flex on him. Speaking of flexing, let's talk a bit more about the pit. See, this roguelike mode, I call it this because there's persistent upgrades between runs. Things like unlocking brand new types of cards to find, armor, and all that fun stuff is retained between runs, which can definitely empower you. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff was essentially already unlocked in the base game, so it's more you're just returning yourself to base functionality on top of all the other intrinsic issues I've mentioned. It's just frustrating. It's just frustrating. And that's a shame, really, since when I'd initially given A Long Way Down a gander, I'd actually found myself genuinely fond of its aesthetic. It's not a bad-looking title by any stretch of the imagination. And heck, while my actual appearance did modify over the course of the game, I did appreciate that the visual design of the cards changed as I upgraded a number of them. That said, where I held a certain degree of fondness for its visuals, its audio elements were more apt to cultivate a prolonged sense of indifference. And the fact that that's all I have to say is probably a pretty good measure of that. And, so yeah, that's really the moral of today's story, now that I've come around to the conclusion. A Long Way Down is just a practice in tedium. At its core, there's certainly some interesting ideas, both in regards to its narrative, the way combat could have been, and even the means in which you navigate the dungeon. And yet, while I did make my way through the game, it wasn't fun. I stuck it out to the end more out of a sense of compulsion. The idea that I do my best to finish the games I review, and to see if there's some sort of narrative payoff. And, I didn't really get any sense of satisfaction at the end. I mean, sure, there was like a grim hilarity in turning the final boss, just slamming them so hard they'd side-eyed a screen door during summer and wishing that was them instead. But honestly, I just found the crux of my time to be fairly annoying. There's just so many titles that manage the deck-building roguelike genre better. Monster Train, Slay the Spire, Night of the Full Moon, Neoverse. Yeah, ultimately, A Long Way Down is a fail in my book, and I ultimately would rather recommend someone's attention to any of the other games I just mentioned. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.